I had an amazing evening last night. I came out and we got together with family that I had never met. And in fact, I found out from my late father's, he had written his memoirs, and I just got a chance to read those recently, that in fact his father's brother had a big house in Palo Alto. And so I found out that the family, some of whom are here, many of them are Stanford graduates or current Stanford students. That was interesting. What was really good was I found out they own the house, and I also have reason to believe they own all the land that Stanford is on, and still do. We're flexible. We work out some kind of rental agreement, I think. But there'll have to be a few changes, and I think you'll get used to uniforms and marching over time. We're going to talk about a couple of things today, and I thought that one of the things, a good thing to talk about, is the meaning of life. And the meaning of life, of course, is explained in this diagram here. If I put this up, if they taught it at West Point, the cadets would be required to measure the length, work the angles, know exactly what the balls are, but they wouldn't give a damn whether they knew the meaning of life. But I was counseled here that I'm speaking to a very august crowd, and so I should not speak down to Stanford students. So, any questions? This is going to be a lot easier than I thought. On the 30th September 2004, in the El Amel neighborhood of Baghdad in Iraq, 5 seasoned, hard-looking men moved down the street. It was a very difficult time in that part of the city. They moved into an abandoned house, and inside there was still some furniture, broken glass, and things like that. And they met 3 other men. They began to discuss an operation. They were soldiers. They began to discuss an operation that would be conducted. This was a difficult part of the war. Those individuals knew war. They made plans to conduct an operation that would be both dangerous for them and require very, very careful planning. Ultimately, because of the nature of the operation, they wore local garb, and they used local vehicles. And they had 2 vehicles, and then they had some people who would move on foot. When they were prepared, they occupied 2 of the vehicles, and then the people on foot took off. And they moved toward their target where their enemy was meeting. The enemy was meeting at the opening of a water sewage plant. As the individuals came, the first vehicle carried the first group of fighters, 2, moved to the target area. It moved right into the crowd, and then with a click of a switch, the car exploded. It created mayhem. But the crowd began to gather back in again. The crowd had been Iraqi officials, American soldiers handing out candy to young children, and a disproportionate young number of Iraqi children. When the crowd had filled back in again, the second car arrived, and it too detonated. 42 human beings were killed, 35 of whom were children. 141 people were wounded, 72 of which were also children. And the sense of a military operation of the kind that we are not normally prepared for had to be gathered. Because this group of fighters were al-Qaeda in Iraq. They had become hardened professionals in a sense. And they'd conduct a very well-run operation with a new set of rules. So today I thought we'd talk about doing the right thing. But I'm not going to talk about it from a sense of morality. I'm going to talk about a sense of what this means for the future of organizational leadership. How things are happening in the real world and how I think that they will happen in the future. In 2003, I took command of the Joint Special Operations Command. That organization was known by its acronym JSOC. I'd served in it for much of my career. I'd served in Afghanistan before this, and I took command of this unique organization. And this organization was formed after the failure of the 1980 attempt to rescue Americans held hostage in the American embassy in Tehran. And it was designed to bring together America's most elite special operating units, Delta Force, SEALs, Rangers, others, into this umbrella organization or task force that could do all the difficult missions that the nation envisioned we would need in the future. The failure of the Iranian rescue mission, Operation Eagle Claw, gave impetus, and fairly quickly the resourcing and talent gave real strength to this command, real ability. So I took command in the fall of 2003 in Iraq. By 2004, if I were to describe JSOC to you, it was a pretty unique entity. It was elite. Every individual in the organization went through a selection and assessment process, selection to get selected, then a very detailed training process. It was well-resourced, extraordinarily so, better than any other part of the U.S. military. In fact, if you had an idea of a new piece of equipment or requirement or weapon, we had the ability to fund and get that on very, very rapid timelines. And it was efficient. It had developed processes. It had developed a culture of doing things very, very well. So it was this very effective, unique entity. By the summer of 2004, we were also losing. And you say, what does losing mean? It's not like not making a profit this quarter. It doesn't feel like that. It feels and looks much different than that. It feels like tragedy. It feels like loss of life. It feels like loss of national and individual futures and dreams. And it requires people to come to grips with the fact you can lose, and you have to do something about it. We knew that something was different in this particular fight. We were so good, but we knew that the environment was different. The 21st century was different than what we had prepared for and what we had experienced earlier in our careers, and needed something new, but we didn't know what it was. We just knew we were doing all the other things we'd been taught to do, but they weren't working like they used to work. So today what I do is I thought I'd take you through what we think had changed, what we needed to do, and then ultimately what we did. So let's talk about change. Everybody goes through change in your professional life and your personal life. When I was young, I had things pretty good. As you can see, I saved money on what beer I drank to buy nice trousers. But my misspent youth had an end date, and that end date came this day. When Annie Corcoran then agreed to be my wife. And imagine me looking down the aisle, seeing a beautiful girl, and then seeing her dad. Ruh-roh. But when you get married, a lot of things change in your life, but one thing doesn't change at all. Annie hasn't changed in 37 years. Not at all, I have to say that. That's how you make 37 years. But your life changes, and pretty soon after that, a few years later, Annie blessed us with a child, a son. And so I did what everybody does when you got a son. I hang him upside down, I flipped him around like this. And Annie does what every mother does. She goes, "Don't do that, you'll give him brain damage." I said, "I'm not going to give him brain damage." This is my son in high school. Maybe a little bit. But he waltzed through Florida State for a 4-year degree in 7 years. But just so you think there isn't justice in the world, he's in Afghanistan now serving for the government, so it does come around. But things change. Things change a lot for each of us, and change in the environment. We got to recognize, admit it, and deal with it. So what's the new environment look like? Well, we throw all kinds of words about the new environment. All the buzzwords. I don't even know what recursive means, but it means change, I guess. But when I look at all of this, really 2 terms came down after we studied this that really meant more than all the others. One was tight coupling. And what we mean by tight coupling is when things are linked together or networked, almost like a power grid or an ecosystem or a set of computers that are linked together, when they're coupled so that when something happens in one part of it, it may affect all or parts of the rest of it. And you think of this in an ecosystem of fish and whatnot, and if something happens in one, maybe food source or whatever, suddenly you can have this cascading effect that you're really not ready for. And it's very, very complex, and tight coupling increases it. And then tight coupling is affected by speed. And we say, okay, we know things are faster, but we don't really know how much faster it is. Think about how things used to arrive to you. Maybe the oldest people here today remember this kind of delivery. But probably most of us will see this kind of delivery. Things will happen at a speed we're not prepared. And when you put the 2 things together, the effects of tight coupling and speed, you get some interesting effects. But what are you affecting? You're affecting what we called the elegant solution. This is what was taught in business schools for many, many years. The elegant solution was great. I mean, just look at it. It looks good. Put that on the wall of your office. Looks like you know what's going on. Information goes down, goes through set paths. After a certain period of time, at the end of the day, end of the week, end of the month, whatever you specify, the information comes back up. There are right angles. There are blocks that fit neatly. And different parts of the organization, if they need to communicate, there's a process to do that. It's going to go this way, you're going to talk to this, and it's going to happen just like this. You know, it was designed, the elegant solution was designed to create order, to solve a problem, to create efficiency. And people are always doing that. At the end of the First World War, the great takeaway was that defensive arms were stronger than offensive arms, and trenches worked very well to stop enemy attacks. So in the interwar years, specifically the 1930s, the French looked at a growing strength in Nazi Germany, and they decided we need to do something to protect ourselves. So they created something which has become almost a byword for stupidity. They created something called the Maginot Line. And the Maginot Line was designed to defend the border between France and Germany from German invasion. And if you look at the Maginot Line, it was actually a pretty amazing thing. At the top, it had these steel cupolas and partially buried cement and concrete facilities, very difficult to target, very difficult to get at, but easy to man with a small number of forces. Vertically, it went down on the ground, and it had elevators that went down through multiple levels. And at the multiple levels, like at one level, you'll have ammunition. Another level, you'll actually have railroads that connect to different parts of the line for very efficient. The idea was with a very small number of forces, you could defend against a huge potential German attack. And together, it was a pretty amazing engineering feat. And everybody says, well, this is just a monument, I think Patton said, a monument to the stupidity of man. The thing about the Maginot Line is it worked. It did exactly what it was designed to do. The Germans did not breach the Maginot Line in 1940 when they invaded France. The French had solved that problem. But they had not solved the real problem, the big problem. The Germans went around it. They went to the north. And they came through. So in effect, the solution worked, but didn't solve the problem. So the answer was to an incorrect question. So we go back to the elegant solution, and we start to say, well, it's so neat, it's so clean, it's so comfortable. What could be bad about this, or what could be the weakness? Because it was vertically stratified into horizontal tiers, tiers of rank or authority. It was horizontally stratified into vertical silos, typically around a functional area, part of an organization. And if you think of the horizontal tiering, information would go down and it would go up, but it assumed that the organization had adequate time for information to flow through those pathways. But speed, as things sped up, actions around them, suddenly that was tested, that has been tested. And within the vertical silos, the functional silos, there was an assumption that as you broke these silos down, you assume an exclusive relationship, i.e. the vast majority of the interaction is inside those silos, and it fits comfortably there. And if somebody needs to do business, most of what they do can be done right inside that silo. But as tight coupling kicks in and increases in its reality, suddenly, if you've got to do business in one part of the organization, but it doesn't reside only in your silo, if it affects many other parts of the organization, suddenly you got problems. Because across the organization, the pathways to connect these parts and deal with the tight coupling are ponderous. So speed and tight coupling suddenly challenged the functionality of the elegant solution. So what did we need? That was really what we faced. What did we need in Iraq? First off, as I talked about, JSOC was tasked with defeating al-Qaeda in Iraq, which we called AQI. And go back and look at what was the force I had. It was an extraordinarily elite, effective force, conventionally organized. It had some really important traits. It had a very clear and effective structure. It had very understood and rehearsed processes. It could measure what it did, and it could optimize or get the most efficiency out of the organization possible. Hit the most number of targets, do it with the right kinds of people. And so efficiency, the most effective executors should have been dominant. And in fact, we didn't know it at the time, but we were actually disciples of a guy named Frederick Winslow Taylor. Born in the middle of the 19th century near Philadelphia, son of a very successful lawyer, Frederick Winslow Taylor in 1874 applied to college. There was no Stanford, so he applied to Harvard. He got accepted to Harvard, but he wisely chose instead to go work on a factory floor. Just take a basic job on a factory floor. And there he became fanatical in his desire to understand the concept of best practices. What works best? How do you get the most efficiency out of an organization? And he eventually produced a book, which you're undoubtedly familiar with, Scientific Management, and became a Bible, really, for the 20th century and how we do things. Break everything into its tasks, something we could call reductionism, and then pull those tasks together, and if they're all efficiently done, you got a great process. I think it's really represented well by a really good assembly line. If you get that right, it's going to be hard for any other approach to be more effective. Against this, we have al-Qaeda in Iraq. They were not organized like we were. They were organized like this loose network of associations. We kept trying to put them on whiteboards and we map out their structure, top and tiers down, but they never got that memo. And they were instead organized by friendships and family associations and who'd served together in Afghanistan, who had other relationships, who was married to whose sister. I don't think this was carefully thought out and planned, but it became the organic way in which they were structured, and what it gave them was extraordinary adaptability because they didn't have a manual that they were violating. Their manual was survive and win. And so suddenly this extraordinarily, the apogee of efficiency is up against this child of adaptability, and we were having big problems. So we thought a lot about this, and you say, what is efficiency? Efficiency, if you get it down here, it's getting the most Y, what you want, with the least X. It's making the most cars with the least steel. It's doing the most raids with the fewest forces. It's making the most money with the least investment. And it's pretty straightforward. All you got to do is clarify what Y is, and then focus until you figure out the most efficient X. But it assumes you know Y. It assumes you know what you have to do, the output or requirement. But speed and tight coupling have produced something we call emergent properties. And emergent properties are when you put together phenomenon like those, you get unexpected outcomes. You get a different environment that those qualities have changed. And so suddenly, Y is not so easy to solve for. Think of it this way. We're going to talk about springs. As we get more data now, we can collect more information now very, very quickly, and we can predict weather better than ever before. Now, forget things like global warming, but just typical weather patterns. As we get more and more information, our ability to predict weather has gotten increasingly effective. So it ought to apply to everything, but think of the Arab Spring. We have more and more ability to watch what's happening, talk to people, deal, more and more data, but in reality, the Arab Spring is a complex event that is affected itself by more data. As more information passes, more communication, more complexity. So we are trying to gather more data, but exponentially, that which we are trying to measure and predict is more complex. So more data does not equal more predictability. And that can produce something we call predictive hubris. In 1973, they did a study. And the study gave people who were well experienced in horse racing information. First, they gave them 10 pieces of information about all the horses, and they asked them to predict the outcome, and they measured their confidence in how accurate they thought their prediction would be. Then they gave them 20 variables and asked the same thing. Interestingly enough, with 10 variables, their accuracy was X. With 20 variables, with 20 pieces of information, their accuracy didn't go up at all. But their confidence that they had it right went up significantly. So they were more confident, probably with the second, than they should have been because they had more data, but they didn't really have more reason to be accurate. So you can have a phenomenon which predictive hubris. And think of the times in life where we assume something is going to happen because it has happened before, because data says it is, and then we are completely surprised. So now we say if we're going to go back to our equation of getting the most with the least X, what if you don't know Y, and it's pretty hard to figure out the other variables? Suddenly you're dealing with constantly changing requirement. You don't even know what the problem you're going to have to solve tomorrow is. So getting a perfectly efficient solution to that is elusive. So adaptability becomes the holy grail. And the way I put that is adaptability is a difference between doing things right, doing things by established processes, habits, training, and doing the right thing, doing what works, becomes your tension. And if you go back to Iraq, the difference between my force and Al-Qaeda in Iraq, as much as we tried, we carried the baggage of doing things right. If you don't violate your processes, the principles you've been taught, people won't criticize you even if you fail. But I did all the right things. No, if you lost, you obviously didn't. Against an enemy whose only metric was survival and success. So efficiency comes up against adaptability, and efficiency comes up the loser. So what we did was we melded the two. We tried to take the best of what we do, put it together with extreme adaptability, and change the way we thought and operated to make it work. So how did we do that? What did it look and feel like? We all know small teams. Everybody's been on a basketball team or a small class or something where it just feels easy. You can finish each other's sentences. You can predict what people are going to do. What's the nature of those that allows that to happen? Most of us remember the 1st of May, 2011, and the raid that ultimately killed Osama bin Laden. Had we been watching in real time, as some people were in the White House and other locations, as the 2 special helicopters came to land in the compound, one of the helicopters crash landed. Now that's 50% of your assault force crash lands before you get anywhere eyeball to eyeball with the enemy. And you go, we're screwed. But if you understand these operations, and while I was in command, we probably did several thousand of equal complexity, something always went wrong. That was well within the span of what we typically expected and experienced. So when an aircraft goes down, it's not like, we got to go back and try again another day. Nope, we deal with it. And so that had been built into the DNA of the force. That had been built into the people. So what does make a team great? We always say, well, go get the best people you can, sum of its parts. Get together talent, and you're going to win. I call that the dream team fallacy. For those of you who remember the U.S. men's basketball team in 2004, brought together the best professional basketball players in the world, walked away with a bronze medal, while Argentina got the gold. So strictly speaking, just talent doesn't do it. A team is not the sum of its parts. There's something else. Navy SEALs, this calendar came out in 1992. We gave them an amazing amount of shit over this. As you can imagine. But if you think of Navy SEALs, you say, why are SEALs so effective? It's because they are all genetically superior, brilliant, motivated, etc. But in reality, to be a SEAL, it's difficult, but there are many people who can do it. The physical standard for swimming is to do 2 miles in 75 minutes with fins. Now, not everybody here can do 2 miles in 75 minutes. But this 64-year-old lady, Diana Nyad, did 2 miles in less than 75 minutes, and then she swam 108 more miles, staying under that same pace the whole time. So it's not a case of supermen. It's not a case of people who just are identified for their exquisite abilities. It's something else. And I think part of it is trust and purpose. Now, what is trust? Trust is, we use the term a lot, but I'm not sure we really know what it is. It's faith in your colleagues, but it's also familiarity with them. It's that special relationship that comes between people in organizations where you absolutely know and can rely on what they're going to do and why. And it builds that special bond. In Navy SEAL training called Basic Underwater Demolition School, BUDS, everything is designed to build trust between people. They have to go somewhere with another swim buddy all the time. All of the drills that are done with either a group or at least one other person. It's designed to build that special linkage of trust. And purpose. One of the things that we do in elite units is we make the training regimen to get in, the selection process, so hellacious that it takes this huge commitment. It involves physical pain, sometimes fear, often a lot of sacrifice of time and other things to get in that organization and to be a part of that. You have made a big commitment to be a part of that. One of the things it does is it helps identify those people who are aligned, and it also increases the alignment because that's what you invested in, you tend to feel committed to. And so really trust and purpose changes the basic calculus between individuals. So trust and purpose is an emotional linkage. Then you give them a contextual linkage, i.e. they have shared information. They all can get access to shared information. Suddenly you get something that we call shared consciousness. Now that shared consciousness is almost a magical property because people who have trust and purpose and then they understand and see similarly, not agree with everything, that's not the point, but it produces this emergent intelligence and awareness that is shared between them. So think about it. Ants. The average ant is said to have 7 neurons of brain power. I served with guys with about that level, but hundreds of thousands of ants can come together, and without a spoken language, without a written language, without any handbook, without any formal education, they can create these extraordinarily functional colonies and do these amazing things like this ant hill. 7 neurons of brains. So now, let me stop for just a second here, because I've got a classmate of mine from West Point here, a guy named Ed Evans, and he and I were right at the bottom of the class in math. And I just want to celebrate the moment with you, Ed, that I am at Stanford's business school teaching a math equation. Our instructors would roll over in their graves. So what am I saying here? I'm saying efficiency or effectiveness of the team, the excellence, is a function of the individual excellence, the talent and the commitment of individuals, and shared consciousness. Sort of makes sense. And that individual excellence is what we bring to the table or is built inside us. And then that connection between us is that almost that magic elixir that changes that relationship. And you can apply this at various levels. Excellence at different levels, you can look at it that way. We're familiar with small teams because that's sort of natural. But think of it at any given level. It's a function of excellence one level down, the component pieces, times the level of shared consciousness one level down. So if your pieces work together, and we would think about it this way, a SEAL team, an aggregate unit of SEALs, is the function of individual SEALs times that shared consciousness shared between them. Now in JSOC, we understood this intuitively. It was in our culture, it was in our DNA, it was how we operated, it was how we thought, it was everything about who we were. But yet, at the next level, we got it completely wrong. Because at the JSOC level, where we were a larger unit that was made up of larger components, suddenly at the team level, we had really good teams. But when we did things to operate together, we kidded ourselves. This would be the setup for what we called ellipse exercises. Every quarter, 4 times a year, we did these complex special operations exercises to build the team into this effective team. And we would typically bring task forces. Blue is a SEAL, green is Delta, red is the Rangers. We bring all this complex entity together. We're going to do a complex operation to show how closely our teamwork works. But most of the operations looked a lot like this. There would be 3 objectives. The SEALs would hit 1 objective, Delta would hit 1 objective, and the Rangers would hit 1 objective, geographically dispersed so we didn't run into each other. You take those objectives down, then you return back to the base, and then you'd have this combined, what we called a hot wash or after action review, see how it went. We didn't really do a complex operation. We really did 3 separate operations. In many cases, the forces on those didn't really work together. They weren't really, in this training environment, tightly coupled. So we didn't produce what we thought we were producing. We didn't produce inside the organization that shared consciousness between the larger teams. So where we got it right at the low level, automatically, when we took it up a level, we got it wrong, but didn't think we had it wrong. So how do you scale this? How do you get it up and make it work at larger levels? Because this is where it gets hard. Anybody can make a basketball team work together. Well, almost anybody. You start with 1 team, small team. You got emotional and intellectual connections that have to be built. At the emotional level, you know everybody. At the intellectual level, you all have total awareness, and that's pretty easy to do. When you start to go at a higher level, bigger, suddenly you have to take a team of team approach because there's just things you can't do to make An individual team cannot be too large. So the approach has to be somebody has to know somebody else or someone else in another organization. So there have got to be connections, not between every individual, but between every organization at some human level. And you have to have practical contextual awareness. Not everybody can know everything, but you've got to have enough linkage so that it pulls you into a similar relationship that the small team enjoys. Think about the old system as you try to build this intellectual synchronization, as you try to get everybody on the same sheet of music. Inside our vertical silo in our old elegant solution, we typically had things which made that work. You had environmental context. Everybody shared. They saw what was happening in their part of the factory, their part of the business. They got that. They had organizational context. They knew people. They knew how it was structured. It was pretty comfortable. And technologically, they were constrained. It was hard to reach out and talk to people in the other part of the organization because you had to go to another building, another state. We didn't have email, phones quite as easily as we do now. So maintaining connections was automatically constrained so it wasn't assumed. Well, all that's changed, obviously. When you think of effective intellectual synchronization, we think of NASA. And so what do you think? You think of the movie Apollo 13, and you think of the control room, and you think of failure's not an option, everybody going check, 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 check. The real miracle of NASA didn't occur in the Apollo 13 control room. It occurred in the development of the Apollo program, which was amazing. What they were doing in less than a decade was creating technology, all of which was changing as they did it, pulling pieces of all this technology together to create something that was extraordinarily different from anything that had been done. And they pulled this engineering effort together at disparate locations in real time, in less than a decade. It's probably one of the best case studies of an organization being able to share information. Remember, this is before they were empowered with as many information sharing tools as we have now. In Joint Special Operations Command, when I took over, we had a very small update every day for leaders in the organization. So we kind of get in a huddle and pass information and synchronize. We started with about 50 people in it. By the time I gave up command, it was more than 7,000. We did it every day. 90 minutes long every day, essentially the whole command. So everybody shared information, knew where we were going, what we're doing, and what updates and changes had occurred. So you need some kind of robust communication form. Doesn't all look the same, but there's got to be a way where everybody develops that shared consciousness. And you got to be emotionally tied because people act on emotion. We started with frequent, casual exposure. You know, you run into people. Think about it. If you don't see somebody in a long time, it's hard to have conversations. But if you see them constantly in your dorm, in your office, wherever, you start to talk. We were running operations that depended upon aircraft who did surveillance, did full motion video. And we had fighters, shooters, or operators who were going to go on the targets. As much as possible, I brought all of those to single base locations because what I wanted is, I wanted the pilot who was going to fly that very sensitive reconnaissance mission during the attack. When they came back and they went to the mess hall, I wanted them to run into the operators who'd been on the mission. And I wanted them to feel shared, and if one of them had screwed it up, I wanted them to see each other eyeball to eyeball. Because it's a lot easier to screw somebody that you don't have to see the next day. But we had to go even deeper. We had to also do embedded exposure. What we did was, in fact, the SEALs in Delta didn't have diplomatic relations when I took over. It was sort of like Iraq and Iran, which was amazing because they're very similar in culture and background, but maybe too similar. So I said, okay, we're going to have an exchange program. You're going to take people from the organizations, exchange, and put them in the organizations of the other assault teams. And the first thing I was told, can't do it. Cannot be done because we grow up together, we have our culture, we've got to rely on the guy to our right and left, and so it's unfair to put this external person in there. And I understood that, and I recognized, I said, but that's all right. We're going to do it anyway. Because it's hard to hate somebody you know, with a few exceptions. But some months after we started doing this, we had a firefight in Iraq, and one of our operators was shot, and he lost his leg. And the investigation turned out he'd been shot by friendly fire. He'd been shot by one of our own operators. And then we found out he'd not only been shot by one of his own operators, he'd been shot by one of the exchange guys from the outside. And I said, that's it. Everybody's going to bring out every antibody to this, and they're going to throw this on the table, and they're going to tell me, see, you're responsible, you got it wrong. And that's not what happened. They said, no, that stuff happens. He was doing the right thing. He's one of us. Let's move on, to include the guy who lost his leg. We had been just long enough where they had gotten over that, and now it became an empowering thing. The guy who lost his leg, interestingly enough, courageous guy, 18 months later was back in the fight on a prosthetic leg. Still is. So shared consciousness, really, with our meaning of life ball here, is a combination of the intellectual and emotional components of this. But back to speed. It's one thing to get it right, as long as you get it right fast enough. As fast as you have to have it. And this was a real problem for us. Because if you think back to the original hierarchical model, we always draw a triangle for this. At the top of that model, what do you got? You got information going up where people think. That's where the thinkers are. People that have assigned parking spaces. And at the bottom, they give commands down. You got people who are doing it, people who are actually doing the work. So you got the people up here thinking and the people down here doing. And yet it can be a problem. There's a lot of history for it. If you think of Army units, traditionally, they're very much directive. Armies would get in formation, they would march in formation. The whole purpose was to get everybody at the same place at the same time so you could focus either in combat or otherwise without losing people and being disorganized. The Navy had a different approach. Inside a ship, there was tremendous discipline and focus, but once a ship was sent, you couldn't talk to it. When Admiral Perry went to open Japan, they kind of patted him on the head and say, go on over there and do an incredibly important thing for American foreign policy. Let us know how it goes. They couldn't guide him, so they didn't try to. They said, go out and do what makes sense. Pretty interesting difference and adapting to situation. But nowadays there's this danger, there's this seduction of situational awareness. You can get on the internet, you can read every paper, you can talk to people, you can call anybody you want, you can do it in real time. By 2005 and late on to the rest of my tour, I could sit in my command center, and in the command center there were about 8 or 12 of these flat panel screens, and what they would have is full motion video, downlink from Predators and other air things that are giving me real-time TV coverage of every operation we're doing. And I could sit there and I could watch everything that's happened. I could watch what's going on the target. I could watch the raid force I could arrive. I could watch the firefight. And because we took the radio signals and pumped them into our internet, I could listen to every radio call. I could listen down at the lowest level. I could listen to operator 1 talking to operator 2. And guess what? If I wanted to, I could push a button, I could talk to them. But I never did. Because I realized that that was a seduction of situational awareness. I didn't really know what was going on. I was watching it on TV, but I wasn't down there. I wasn't hearing the crack of bullets. I wasn't cold. I wasn't scared. I didn't have a feel for what was actually happening. But the danger is, because we get all this data now, we watch what's happening in Tahrir Square in real time. We say, well, we think we know what's happening in Egypt. Of course we don't. We may have more data, but it's even more complex than that. And so one of the dangers is not falling prey to this. So what we really had to do to make this work fast enough was to change the thinkers into doers, the doers into thinkers, and everybody became both. And it changed not just how we operated, it changed the culture of who we were and how we thought of what we did. We inverted the model. We decoupled the relationship between information and control. I.e., if I have the information, I have control. because now we could get the information to everybody and more people could control what they did, which allowed us to do what we call empowered execution. We say decentralized operations. You know, if you take decentralized operations too simplistically, you're just pushing your problem down to other people and say, do it. If you don't also give them the authorities and the information, they're operating blind. And it's unfair and ineffective. But if you empower them with those things, suddenly empowered execution lets people operate at the right level, decisions be made at the right level effectively, and they also feel differently about it. They say, how much should you decentralize? Decentralize until you're uncomfortable, and then decentralize one more. What did it do for us? How was it played back to me? In the summer of 2008, August 2008, my force in Iraq did 18 raids. That's about one every other night. Now, I thought we were at a breakneck pace. I thought we were just pedal to the metal. How could you do more operations than one every other night? Because they were planned and they were rehearsed and they were reported up to me and then I'd approve them and then they'd do them. Just couldn't do it. But we were still losing. And not only were we losing, we were starting to lose even more. So we changed how we operated. And 2 years later, we were in the fight the whole time there. 2 years later, same month, same force, same everything else, we did 300 raids that month, 10 a night. We kept that pace up for 2.5 years. You couldn't have done that in a traditional hierarchical model. So when you think about inverting the model, really the two things that became critical first were shared consciousness, we've talked about, letting people have a clear shared understanding, and then the idea that you're going to empower execution. And the two support each other. They're mutually reinforcing. And that's what we now call cross-lead. For those of you who are in love with the elegant model, this is just to make you feel good. Because you worship at the mantra of efficiency. And you have your prophets. We all had our prophets. And they weren't wrong. We got a century of extraordinary value out of being efficiency-minded. But we're not playing that sport anymore. The game has changed. The battlefield, the environment, whatever you want to call it, has changed. And now, I believe, the secret is adaptability. And it's being able to increase our adaptability constantly. Not just our personal adaptability, but at every level. Thank you, and I'll be happy to answer any questions. The question was, what's the single most unexpected thing that I learned? It was probably wrapped up into this. I expected that if we got better and better at what we did, if we honed our skills, shoot straighter, fly faster, do all of those things, that if we got good, that our technological and quality mismatch would allow us to win. That was true at the tactical level. We won every firefight. We had night vision goggles, we had global positioning system, we had incredible people, you know, with tremendous skills and courage. So we won every firefight. The problem is that doesn't equate to winning the war. And for about 2 years, I pressed this organization to get better at what we do, better at what we do, better at what we do. And we're winning all the firefights, and I'm telling myself, therefore, we'll just do this long enough, we'll win the war. That wasn't right. It was like 1,000 people taking an axe and chopping on a tree, but they're all hitting different spots. A lot of bark's flying and whatnot, but the tree's not going down. It wasn't until we figured out to change that model and we had to get more focused into the big outcome that it worked. And it ultimately did. We broke Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Now, they're coming back, but it's for reasons of internal to Iraq. Sir.
General McChrystal, good afternoon. My name is Phil Mazzara. I'm an MBA 1 and a former Navy pilot. You spoke a little bit about how drones had kind of affected your situational awareness. And I'd like to ask you another question about how drones can perhaps affect the calculus when decision makers are making decisions. From a tactical level, as a commander, it seems like the use of drones makes a lot of sense when you're going after a target. If I've got to choose between a manned aircraft and a drone, I'm going to pick a drone every day because we don't put a service member at risk. But from a strategic perspective, when our civilian decision makers are making decisions to use force or not to use force, do you think that the use of drones or the capability of drones alters the calculus and makes it easier?
Yeah, that's a great question. Let me frame it a little bit. First, I think drones are here to stay. We're going to use them. We need to use them, and they're an important part of what we do. And we're actually going to use them even more. So I think that's important. But they are different. They're different because they are perceived differently. Now, if you think about it, there are several factors. The first is, go back to 1988. Anybody remember what happened in 1988? How many of you weren't born in 1988? That's very sad. President Clinton ordered Tomahawk missile strikes into Afghanistan and to Sudan in response to pretty clear activities on the part of Osama bin Laden. Now, if those Tomahawk missiles didn't kill UBL, but they killed various people, created damage, if you'd asked the average American the next morning if we were at war, what would we have said? No, we're not at war. We fired some Tomahawk missiles. If you were near the impact point of a Tomahawk missile and you asked the next morning if they were at war with America, what do you think they'd say? The answer is probably different. So if it lowers the threshold on the use of military force, it's dangerous. And what I mean, if it can be too casual, it can seem too easy, too inexpensive, too risk-free, and it increases your likelihood of doing it, then I would say everyone who orders one ought to go stand next to where one has gone off and where you see body parts and things like that. It's very different. So I'm not saying we don't use them. I'm saying you got to make sure you understand what you're doing. The other part of it is perceptions. We've got problems with some Mexican drug lords in the U.S. and whatnot, and the Mexicans are after them. But what if Mexico flew across the border with drones and did a missile strike in Texas? How would we respond? Probably not well. And it's the perception of we can step back and hurl thunderbolts like Thor without any risk to ourselves that's viewed as arrogance. Now, whether that's right or wrong, perceptions matter in the world. That's why people go to war, because they perceive something. So I think we've got to be very, very thoughtful about how everything we do is actually perceived by others. Again, not throw out the capacity entirely, but be really thoughtful about it.